Okay, hi everyone. It's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here today with Grin Lord. Thanks, Grin, for joining me for this discussion about my favorite topic, which is empathy.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's see. Let me just give a little introduction about you. You're a board-certified licensed clinical psychologist who's provides psychotherapy for children, adolescents, parents, and families.
That's right.
And yeah, and you're also kind of innovating around artificial intelligence, using sort of the therapeutic mental interventions and applying artificial intelligence. Is that correct?
Yeah, I am both a psychologist and a research scientist. I've been working at University of Washington since the early 2000s, and looking at different ways that we can provide feedback to folks when they're doing therapy or counseling, and trying to find ways to automate that. And that is where AI has come in and intersected with that work, because when we've been dealing with the problem of scale, like how do you have an empathy coach or a mentor in the room with you when you don't have that person or expert accessible to everyone. So I've been working on that problem around reach and scale, and we've been looking at technology as a way to provide that.
Oh, wow, that's great. Yeah, I saw an interview. I mean, I came across you by seeing an interview that you did with Anita Novak and Amy and Kevin for their empathy power-ups. And I thought, oh, I have to talk to this person. because I just saw that you really were tuned into the sort of active listening, empathic listening, reflective listening, whatever you want to call it. And that's really sort of where I've come to, as well as this sort of core foundational skill, just the importance of it. And just from reading your material, hearing your interview, it just seemed like you were very tuned into that.
Yes, I'd say that's kind of been a theme in my research, is exploring how much of empathy is like the skills and behaviors that we do, and can you train those behaviors, versus how much of empathy is really kind of having this theory of mind, unconscious kind of synchrony, more global or ephemeral factors that are more difficult to train. I have been working primarily, my work has been focusing on those skills and training people in them as a kind of a baseline for empathy, that if you can't repeat back what you heard, you can't open yourself to curiosity, some of these other things are going to be a lot harder for you. So I'm kind of starting with like, let's just go back to basics, learn some of these skills as a foundation for understanding.
I really love that, because I've been working on the topic of empathy for 13 or 14 years. And that's exactly the insight that I've come to. It's really the foundational, empathic listening based on the work of Carl Rogers and, all the threads that have led from his work. That's really the basics. If you can really focus on that, get those skills down, get that sort of that empathic, way of being or mindset, whatever you want to call it, down, that's really sort of a really good starting point for developing, a more empathic way of being, really.
Yeah, I wrote this article, I don't know if you've seen it, about Carl Rogers and what his, maybe you're really familiar with this.
Yeah,
yes. And I'm curious what you think of that. And, for me, I really, I'll just say this for those that are watching. Basically, the article is quoting different things that Carl Rogers has said about how he was disturbed by the transition that was happening to focus on skills, and particularly in reflective listening. And he was saying, like, this is not me, this is not empathy, this is not the spirit of the work here. You can't have empathy just by having these skills, and like to deconstruct it and to optimize for that is problematic, and kind of went through a different discussion around that.
Yeah, so it's sort of the skill part, or the skill, or sort of the process system part of it, and the sort of more the way of being, maybe that there's maybe a focus on the way of being.
Right, and I've seen that too with therapists, that it is true that you can't learn all of the basic skills. Like there is a gestalt that needs to occur around how you put that together. Not to just keep talking about articles I've written, but there's another one called Bad Empathy, where I basically chronicle or unhelpful empathy, I think. I chronicle all the different ways that you can take these skills and kind of misapply them. So I do think it is a balance between learning like these building blocks and then really having like a core belief that the answer is in the other person, like that there is no strategy or technique to pull out a specific behavior or a goal in the conversation. And as soon as you're working strategically around listening, it's a very different experience than this like idea around evocation and kind of pulling out what the person already knows and like accepting them for who they are. And like those are skills that I think are a little more difficult to train, like acceptance of another person, like this like belief that everyone is worthy and like that they have perspectives that you couldn't possibly know. That part, I think we're still kind of learning about how to train. Which is why I've focused so much on the stuff we do know about and like is correlated with high perceptions of empathy and objective ratings of empathy, is like we know these skills can work. If you can get that, you know, under your belt and practicing that regularly, it will maybe move you towards some of these other goals. But I do think they're kind of different, you know, ways of thinking about the same construct.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, I love talking to you about this because those are so the insights and the thought process you have. I just noticed that, hey, that's sort of very similar to the thought process I have. I got, you know, it's that it's sort of that filter. Yeah, there's sort of these skills, the empathic listening skills that you can just kind of learn and practice and do. But then there's sort of a deeper sort of a mindset, like being able to see the common humanity of everyone, you know, knowing that, wow, there's this common humanity. Every time I talk to people, I see this humanity, and then sort of extrapolating that. It just seems to be true for everyone. No matter who I talk to, I'm going to be able to have that awareness of their common humanity, and just sort of that insight is sort of, I think, what you're trying to go to. There's these deeper sort of premises of the nature of humanity or something that you kind of develop, and it becomes like a filter that you look at through the world with.
Yeah, I'm curious, you know, from your perspective, because I get asked this question a lot, is like whether you believe that the training in these kind of skills can lead to that perspective, or whether, I don't know, I sometimes get questions about that, like, can you really train someone in empathy? Can they actually, if they learn all these skills, does that lead to that kind of more a world shift? So I'd be curious. I should probably know, but I'm not certain the answer.
It's a great issue. Yeah, I think you do over time, but it takes time. Like I when I first did, you know, empathic listening, I thought I sort of extrapolated where it could go, you know, kind of, and then other people who were kind of learning this is that I noticed that it took them a long time to start extrapolating sort of the more universality of where this sort of thought process or way of being. So I think over time, my sense is that over time might take a couple of years even for someone continuously doing empathic listening to start learning, kind of getting that deeper shift of awareness or consciousness is sort of my sense. And what I came with to, you know, in terms of a process is also something called empathy circles. And that's with using the empathic listening, but in small groups of maybe, you know, 4 or 5 people. And you do mutual empathic listening with each other, you know, for a couple hours. And that's that ongoing practice versus sort of therapeutic, which I have sort of problems with. I don't want to put, it's great. Therapy is really important for sort of emergency, you know, listening. I think it's, you know, it's really important. But I think it's sort of missing that relational aspect that as a, you know, as a therapist, you're listening to people, but they're not listening to you and learning this other side of the coin, that they're not learning their listening skills. Plus, they're not learning how to take those listening skills necessarily to their families or, you know, their workspaces and other relationships.
I totally agree, especially in some of the more contemporary forms of therapy, things like motivational interviewing that, you know, like were derived from Rogerian therapy, are extremely goal oriented. You pick a target behavior, you selectively reinforce what you reflect. Like it's not at all relational in the sense like an empathy circle. You may be familiar with some of the work of reflecting teams that like emerged in the 70s, and they were very different as far as probably extremely similar to the empathy circles, and the therapist was a part of those circles, and then they had like a larger outside, so they would do like concurrent circles, and then the outside circle of therapists would go and reflect in on what the therapist in the inner circle did. And there was this very circular, reflective, relational process of having, I would almost call it like a hermeneutic process, where you're like interpreting the other person's interpretation, and then like kind of looking at it culturally and doing this beautiful multi-layered reflective listening work in small groups. So there were therapies like that were much more popular in like a different time, and now you don't see that as much. Like no one's going to pay for 5 or 6 therapists to come in for a community experience with a group of patients. Like their managed care hasn't allowed for that type of thing. So I believe it still exists, but definitely more in the forms of like what you're talking about in an empathy circle. You don't see that in like a hospital or a therapy setting anymore. So I'm only saying that just to say that this is like a moment in time, I think, for therapy and reflective listening, where there is a premium placed on the behaviors and outcomes rather than on the relationships that occur. But it hasn't always been that way, right? So maybe we'll see a shift. I don't know.
So you mean you're seeing it as more goal oriented? You're going for a goal within therapy more, like, is that what you mean? Is it instead of just seeing what emerges, having a space for the emergence of whatever is going to emerge? Is, hey, we have a goal, and what is that goal usually? Would you?
Well, the best therapists will allow for listening to occur in many circles and rounds of reflective listening to determine that goal, where the patient themselves picks it. However, there are settings like, let's say, take an opiate treatment center, where there's a tacit goal around, the goal is to get you onto a specific plan or medication assisted treatment, something like that. And even if you as the patient don't choose that goal, that is why you're coming to this center, and the listening is going to be targeted in that way to get you towards that goal. So I see it more in addictions treatment, that there's this very specific goal, harm reduction, things like that, where empathic and reflective listening does have a very specific target. Again, I'm thinking mainly of motivational interviewing as like the optimization from a behavioral standpoint of some of the core ingredients of Rogerian therapy. But, you know, there's other like humanistic therapies, and like I've been trained in relational psychoanalysis, and it's very reflective and certainly doesn't have that in mind. So I guess I would say that the characterization of all therapy being that way isn't totally my experience, but it is certainly what is happening in mainstream interpretations and understandings of therapy right now.
Yeah, so if you're doing marriage family therapy, that's more relational, right? Trying to get the parties, the families to kind of hear and listen to each other, versus motivational interviewing, which I think you're saying is coming out of the addiction, more for addiction, and you have a specific goal, like, hey, we want to support you in getting out of addiction. Oh, have you seen this book from Bill Miller?
Listening Well. So I have not. Is this
that's William Miller, Bill Miller.
Yeah, I know Bill Miller.
Yeah, so I love this book. He's trying to, he was really describing the empathic listening, process, and he was very concerned about the political polarization and how do we get the different sides listening to each other. And I think that's where his book is sort of headed.
My sense of Bill is that, he's like a real scientist and researcher, and, understanding these core ingredients came from him observing therapists that had good rapport and were doing well, and like figuring out, well, what are the commonalities? And then I think the motivational interviewing movement kind of took that to a next level, even, maybe beyond what Bill had originally envisioned for the outcomes of some of his work. Because I see, the newer versions of his, like the books that he's coming out with, focused more on concepts like forgiveness, which have nothing to do with like open-ended questions, reflections. Like that is not a skill-based idea or goal, and focus more on the spirit of how you are with the person versus the obsessionality around like the ratios of different skills that kind of came out of motivational interviewing. So I definitely see for him a little bit of a swing back to some of his original ideas and principles. But I think the researcher and like all of the cool things that came out of that movement, certainly influenced me too, like knowing that there are certain phrases that if a patient says them to you, they are statistically more likely to make a change in their life. And if you can evoke that, like you can shape behavior, like there's some like real power that came out of that. But I'm not sure that that's what Bill had intended or imagined or envisioned for like a lot of this work. So I see a little bit of a swing also back to some of these things that we were talking about earlier, like how are you with the person? What do you believe about that person? And how does that shape how you are when you're with them?
Well, again, what I've come to is, I was mentioning, is the empathy circle is a foundational practice. And I frame that within a culture of empathy. So you referenced the paper by, Carl Rogers. It was Empathic, an Unappreciated Way of Being, I think was what that article.
Yes.
So it's, I think I see that as sort of a foundational, piece that he explains sort of the empathic process, some of the deeper sort of aspects of it, of the felt experience. And he references Gene Genlin, who talks about, we have this constant flow of felt experience and how you're trying to hear that flow. But for me, I've come to seeing that we need an empathic culture, if we can raise the level within the larger culture, that would be really contribute to general well-being of humanity. And so that's sort of what I've been focusing on and trying to do it there's all that reference material from the therapeutic world, all that really great insight, but how do we bring it to really make it broadly accessible and scalable? I think that's what you're talking about, AI, right? Is how do we really scale these skills and the mindset behind it?
Right. So that's my new project, Empathic, is essentially giving prompts for people to do empathic listening in their texts, their emails, their Slack. Like I'm trying to kind of break down the barriers around learning this and allow there to be an empathy coach in your day-to-day life. So wonderful if you can enter an empathy circle, but not everyone is going to seek that out, right? But there are ways that we can facilitate small empathy circles and reflective listening in day-to-day life. So if I can, for example, our empathy engine does help people to ask open-ended questions rather than make assumptions by giving advice or asking a closed-ended question. So that's just a simple example of a way that if an entire organization was using our tool, the culture of empathy would start to shift in these micro ways where folks are saying, well, what did you think about what happened yesterday? Rather than, did you get that done? And here is like my feedback. Like there's like these small tweaks to the way that folks can talk that are very difficult to integrate from a training into your daily life unless you're getting those prompts. So that's like been the main learning that I've taken from doing empathy trainings for the last 15 years as well, is that after people attend a workshop, like if they stop this practice, it's very difficult to try to pull that in, especially if these skills don't come naturally. So my goal is to have some more prompts and ways of bringing this into people's daily lives. And AI is really useful for that because unlike a human, it doesn't vary, right? Like it will always know when you're about to ask a closed question. If you're not providing a reflective listening, it's going to immediately correct that. And having those type of prompts come to you individually rather than being told by someone else or trained, where you can kind of feel confident in practicing it in this private corrective environment, I think is also a key to success. Because I've seen other types of organizational empathy interventions, and anytime it comes from the top down, where someone's saying, you need to, here's our value as a company and everyone needs to start doing this, like immediately the barrel itself is, starting to rot around empathy, right? You're coming down with this like directive around here's our culture, rather than evoking kind of this internal desire to know another other person or to connect with them and to have that person kind of learn that individually in their interaction. So we're trying to facilitate that in a way that the entire process embodies empathy, but using AI to essentially just bring in that consistency around like, all right, here it is again, decide what you want to do with that. But that's how we're trying to scale, is by bringing it into all of these text-based communications. We can also see applications for things like Zoom in voice, if I was talking to you, having some little prompts or feedback that could be occurring. But I think it's still an open-ended question and a research question as to how does that type of facilitation translate into daily life? Like, can we really learn these skills in that way? Do people absorb it? And then do they start to generalize in their in-person conversations? So we'll be, looking at that as time goes on.
Yeah, that's sort of the culture of empathy that I'm seeing, is that having the intention of how do we transform society and the systems, the structures of society, so that I can see that as sort of a, one system of communication that it's a tool to help you be more empathic in that way. And I had talked with someone who is a designer or developer at Skype.
Oh, interesting.
And they were interested in empathy, and it was kind of like, here we are in the Zoom conversation. I think you're talking about, can you have sort of artificial intelligence that kind of gives you prompts like, okay, Grin is now being very happy, or whatever emotion is coming up, and then you can sort of name that feeling and have tools. And that there's he was like really excited when he heard there was a feedback loop of sort of guessing sort of the felt experience or needs, as some people might call them, or values, and you could have a feedback, artificial feedback loop. He actually had like all kinds of tools. He thought, oh, we already have that, this engine. But then he got reassigned or something, and it never kind of went anywhere. But it's basically using, artificial intelligence within especially in a Zoom or a Skype call.
Yeah. So we're seeing that there are productivity tools. They're called productivity tools, but like for us, we would think of them as in other terms, but that kind of try to give immediate feedback to those that are talking. And I think what I'm trying to do is to really give people the words and not just say like, the conversation is going bad, or like, oh, it's going good. It's like, okay, you're about to give feedback right now. Here's how to phrase it. Like, say some of these lines. Because I think that's the part that is the hardest to train, is some of these, to be honest, they're rules around empathy. Like, there are things that you can do that are objectively like more empathic. If you phrase things in certain ways, it allows the other person to have more room or more experience in talking about themselves. So for example, like if I want to give feedback, asking permission first and saying, hey, would it be okay with you? I've had a couple of thoughts that I've been sitting on. Would it be all right if I share those with you now? That kind of thing, like, opens the other person to hearing the feedback and creates a connection versus saying, yeah, I need to tell you this. So like that little word or phrase is something that I think we could help people, insert these small things that would lead to more openness and connection and empathy. But a lot of people just don't have that ready at hand, right? They're busy, especially in like corporate environments where some of our interventions are taking place. And I'm noticing too, like, I'm curious your thoughts on this, like a little bit of a culture shift with some of the newer generations where there's just less tolerance for, the ways that things were done. Like, it's not good enough to go to an environment where you just make a lot of money and like the work is hard. Like, people want to be in a place where there is human connection and respect. And I think we're seeing that too as the younger generations get into the workforce, that it's just like not acceptable to keep doing things the ways that they were done. But other folks are having difficulty figuring out, well, how do I engage in these ways? Like, how do I completely transform how I sent an email or how I talk to someone when I was used to just being like, hey, go get this done, go do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm noticing some of that too when we're talking with enterprise partners, that like bringing in cross-cultural teams or bringing in different generations together, that in a way, some of what we're doing is fostering empathy by training those folks that like, this is a new way to listen and to be in the environment. And here's the words to do it. And you just need to like observe this and notice it when the prompt comes up, versus going to a whole workshop or training for 2 days and then being like, okay, I'm,
Yeah.
now I don't know how I'm going to like implement this. Anyway, but I don't know if you've experienced that or seen that in some of the empathy circles that you've been working in, but it's certainly been something that I've observed, that there's a little bit of a shift happening.
I haven't seen it, like, I'm not working like in business, per se. So I don't know what the difference, each generation has a different sort of a mindset and expectations. What we've done is, when Trump was elected, there's a lot of political left-right battles happening. I'm here near Berkeley, so we would have the political right come to Berkeley, and then the left, Antifa, and then they'd come into the parks here, and there'd be a knockdown, drag out, fist fights, blood, and you name it. And we have this empathy tent that we set up there, and we offer listening to both sides and try to bring the sides together. There's actually a documentary they featured this called Trump Phobia, What Both Sides Fear. So if you check that documentary out, it shows us mediating between the sides. And so that's different points of view, and how do you bring the sides together. And it was just, it's all based on empathic listening. It's like listening to each side, active listening to both sides, being willing to see their humanity, and then saying, hey, would you like to listen to each other? And we have some tools, when you listen to the person, you first reflect back what they say to their satisfaction until they feel heard to their satisfaction. Then you'll have a chance to speak, and they'll reflect back. And as a facilitator, you kind of have someone that can hold the process, because people get sort of triggered and they want to respond right away, say, no, wait a minute, you'll reflect back. And so trying to teach that skill, and so that's sort of been the
you're
focus.
doing it in real life, like so essentially what our product is trying to do that online, is just continuing to prompt the person in those moments. Just another free association to that, I had a friend that did very similar work during like some of the peak of the political conflicts online, and would do reflective listening, basically do the same thing and facilitate that, and or have individual conversations that were based on listening. I volunteered on deep canvassing call lines. I don't know if you've ever done that or heard of that. And that was interesting too, because a lot of that was based on reflective listening, but then it had a turn where then you suddenly switched into direct persuasion. And so that was like difficult for me to do when I was on the deep canvassing calls, because I was like, I just want to listen to like their perspective and understand where they're coming from and build this connection. But in their script, they have this moment where then after you've gotten this point of empathy, you're like, all right, and now what are you going to do? Like, so that's interesting. And it sounds like you had really some profound impacts in doing that in person in that actual like high conflict environment. I think that's.
Yeah. There was a filmmaker, she saw our work in Berkeley, and she said, oh, there's this impeach Trump rally in Los Angeles. I think this would be great for ending my film, because her film was about the conflict between the left and right. So we went down to Los Angeles, and there was an impeach Trump rally with, several thousand people marching down, one of the main street there in LA. And we set up the empathy tent at the City Hall. I don't know if you've ever been down there, but there's a nice grassy area. We set it up, and across the street is this big police station. And that's where the pro-Trump side was. And we invited one person from each side, into the tent during the day. We had like 6 pairs and did sort of this mediation, empathic mediation.
Oh,
And each pair ended with hugs between the participants.
doesn't surprise
It was
me.
insane. Yeah, it's like it was just like if people can just start hearing each other, it's like, a lot of that stuff just sort of, the conflict really just melts away.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, what your perspective is on technology and doing this, because again, that's my mission, is to try to take essentially what you're doing, and what Rogers and others are doing, and like scale this. I'm interested myself around how successful or non-successful that will be in technology settings, given that there is that relational piece missing. Like, for example, on a Slack conversation where it's really easy to have misinterpretation.
Yeah, I kind of see text as sort of hopeless. For me, it's more the face-to-face in a Zoom call. So we did a whole series of calls, empathy circles, where we try to bring the political left and right together, and especially we had topics like abortion, the pro-choice, pro-life, and you bring them together, and it's just amazing the insights that sort of come up. You start seeing what's really behind the different points of view, and it's like, wow, this really makes sense. You really can hear why people are, taking the position that they do, and they might not solve the problem in a couple hours, but they just start seeing each other's humanity, and that's already a big, a big step. So I see I guess I see the empathic listening as a first step, and I could really see how to build sort of technology, around that to support it. Like the support could be all the scheduling and the organization of how do you schedule these calls. And then we also have training. So how do you, support training in this practice, and then sort of build on that, sort of keep iterating on this basic skill is what I could see.
We have, so I guess, yeah, I definitely, my thesis would be, at its core, to disagree that, like, I think we can do some of this on text, because so many people do relate in that way. But in our models and for our product, for example, we have a trigger for calling a meeting when it's like really clear that this isn't. So I'm just thinking to myself about, I think I agree with you that fundamentally, when you get to a certain level of misalignment or disagreement, that you can't do it in these text ways. One of our corrections actually prevents certain types of toxic emails from being sent, and basically says you need to call a meeting, like, and I could see a future for us facilitating some of that meeting with the AI tech as well. But we're starting with the text and kind of trying to nip some of that in the bud before it escalates, and certainly trying to stop like long text exchanges of disagreement without any reflective capacity. The ways that enterprise have been interested in that have been more from a de-risking standpoint, that they don't want to have like a ton of emails or texts sent back and forth that are highly conflictual in the corporate record for whatever reason.
Oh yeah.
So they have that vested interest.
Right.
Obviously for us, what we're interested in is preventing the conflict and training the empathy. So I think it can be a win-win, but that's interesting, because I think we have that as well, where there's essentially a threshold for how much correction can be done, and if they're not picking up on the reflections, if they're not using them, if it's being rejected and it's going in a certain way, then I think like having face-to-face could be helpful. But is it going to be helpful if you don't have that facilitation there?
Right.
You can't call the empathy tent and then just put the two people in the room, right? Like there has to be the support.
Yeah. I can see that. Oh, I see what you're saying. That I'm saying it's hopeless. In my experience of like on Facebook or whatever, when people start conflict, if they're starting a conflict with me or there's a real disagreement, I'll say, let's have an in-person recorded empathy circle because you just can't see all what's really happening. We can slow the conversation down, but if you have a highly structured process for the text and everybody has agreed to take the process and say, can you reflect this and so forth, I could see that I could see how that could be helpful if you have a really whole support system, structured support system that everybody sort of agreed to take part. Yeah, so that makes sense.
Maybe I could add empathy circle mode to our, like where
Mhm.
rather than just having the prompts come into your daily workforce, you could initiate this particular like consensual mode that like both people will agree to 100% take the prompts and do the reflective listening in this time to get through it. That seems like it could be really useful.
Yeah, I've got the principles of a culture of empathy. I've been kind of working on that. One of the principles is being willing to listen to anyone, right? Be willing to have an empathic dialogue with anyone, no matter who they are. For a culture of empathy, I agree, I'm willing to listen. Second is to be actively reaching out to different people. And then a third principle is if there is a conflict, I agree, I will take part in an empathy circle with that person, right? So I think for like you're saying, yeah, you need a facilitator to support that. But if the business or organization or family, for that matter, has done empathy circles beforehand, has developed trust in the process, and has the skills down that they can then if they call an empathy circle, they can either hold it themselves or they have a community of support. Like we have, a couple hundred people who have done the training, and you can reach out to them to be in your circle to help support you. So there's a whole web of support that can be built around that empathic dialogue.
Yeah, I feel like that's the vision, right? Like that's the ideal. And I would love to see something like that happening in the places where people work every day. And I think on the other side, like what I'm experiencing is that like low lift solutions are the ones that are the most easily adopted, which is why I've kind of come full circle to this place of like, if I can just teach them to reflect, like if we could just have a whole company just learning a reflection, like don't need a structure, don't need to call a meeting, don't need to do anything. Like we're just going to practice this one thing is like, let's start there. So
Absolutely.
that's kind of like, I guess been my journey has been like, all right, I'm starting with these 3-hour workshops. We're going to do all this stuff. And now I'm like, all right, can you repeat back what you heard? Like, let's like go there first. And that's where like the culture of empathy, for me is starting is like, let's teach us one skill. If I could teach a whole company to do this one skill, like amazing. Like
I'm totally there. That's when I saw the interviews with there. I immediately picked up that was your core, because that's exactly where I came to. Is this simple, thank you, Carl Rogers, for kind of mapping this out. It's the mutual though. The thing that was missing with Rogers is it was tended to be more one direction.
It is strategic. Yeah.
Even though he did, what do you call it, encounter groups and stuff like that. But even the counter groups weren't using empathic listening. So everybody wasn't using it. So yeah, I'm totally there. So it's like, so the question becomes, how do we really spread this, simple practice, just learn this is sort of step one. If we can get everyone familiar with it, sort of knowing how to do it, trusting, there's a certain level of trust in the process too. And, sort of the strategy, I'm looking at kind of the bigger social structures. So, we go out to the public, with these empathy tents, do public listening. So I'm imagining we get the Congress to do empathy circles with each other, right? We get the high profile people, get the CEOs of the companies to do empathy circles with with the staff or employees to really model the practice, say, oh, they're not just telling me to be more empathic, they're actually doing it.
Yeah.
And you learn through observation too, the process. So if Trump and Biden had done an empathy circle together, instead of a debate, I mean, it would change the whole culture, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And just personally, as a CEO of a startup, we've definitely instituted that in our practice. Like when we get to a certain place, it's like, all right, everyone has to reflect. And people really enjoy that. They're like, oh, I love like working with a psychologist, or like, it's just so different, and I'm like, yeah, this doesn't have to just be, seen as part of therapy or a touchy-feely intervention. Like this actually makes work more productive and effective, because there's more alignment and more open dialogue and discussion. So I wish that would be more of a norm in how people react. And it sounds like you're inspiring a lot of that culture shift and implementing it, and you're going to the places. I mean, I think that's like, for me, what resonates the most is that you're like going out to the places where the conflict exists and trying to work on it there, versus self-selection in like an opt-in for folks that already are interested in empathy. And that definitely aligns with my work, where I'm saying like, I'm going to go meet them where they're at. We're going to go work in Slack. We're going to work in email, because that's where people are having conversations in the corporate world. And like, I will be there to facilitate in those digital spaces for folks that aren't necessarily saying, I'd like to devote hours of my day to an empathy workshop, and like, I want to become an empathy trainer. It's like, anyone can learn this, and we just have to like get into those spaces to provide them the tools. And you're right that there is like a profound transformation. I think once people experience being heard or listened to, and like understand like the basic tools, I really do feel like it's every person that I've taught reflective listening to has been like, I can't believe I didn't know this in school, or like, why has it been so long? And I didn't know it was so simple. Like I sometimes would like flounder in conversations, because I'd be trying to think, well, what do I ask them next? Or like, what kind of fact what topic? And it's like, no, you just listen, you just reflect. It can really unlock a whole different way of being. So I think that's great that you've found this way to transform culture by going out to people where they're at. And I think I'm trying to do the same thing digitally. We'll see if it works, but it's that I like the mission and the alignment around transforming from the bottom up, and like just having people have that experience of being heard.
Yeah, I think that's the intention, though, just holding that intention and keep iterating, looking for, where are those spaces that sort of open up, because you just don't know until you, kind of try and, see what happens. It's sort of more the human-centered design sort of approach, fail early, fail often, just keep working, iterating, and, sort of those opportunities or the insights sort of emerge through just trying.
Well, this is my third empathic like venture startup. Obviously first it was doing more of what you were doing, like actual trainings in this type of listening, granted for medical providers and therapists. So it was a little bit different. And then Listen was my first startup, where we trained therapists by doing a recording of their therapy and then giving them the feedback of like, here's how many reflections you did, here was your empathy rating, like here's all this stuff, this automated report. But my experience of that, just in using it, was that people don't really learn from an automated report. Like that's not helpful to get your scores on empathy. And then like, you can't really translate that. You do need that relational experience, or at a minimum, the relational coaching and supervision around like, oh, what was that like for you when you were listening to that person and X happened? What did you experience? What was your, that's how to get people to a place of insight and empathy, and not like, well, you got an 8 out of 10. So like, I don't know what that means. So Listen was like one attempt to try to scale this. And I still think it's like really cool and successful and has a lot of reach for people. But when I created Empathy Rocks, which was the empathy training games, it's literally, they can go there, and these are available right now. You can go and you get a prompt from a real person on the internet, and you just have to like repeat back what you heard, and you just practice it, and it gives you like a correction. And it's almost like batting practice for empathy, where it's just like skill. No, you're not in a conversation, so you're missing out on the actual relational experience, but it's drilling that part of your brain that to get into a mode where I'm going to try to understand what I just heard and repeat it back in a way that moves us closer to each other and understanding, just in a rote way. Like, how many times a day can I do that, so that when I'm in a live conversation, I can actually rely on that kind of skill. But then I took it like the next step into the current thing where I'm like, I don't even want them to have to go into an app or play. Like they're just going to get the correction where they're working and playing.
So you keep iterating, you have that intention, you're just iterating, you're trying, you're getting the insights, and you're coming up with the next project.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep going, and then maybe I'll end up back and do empathy circles with you. I'll be like, it didn't work, but but that's my mission, is like scaling, figuring out how can we get it into people's hands quickly and into spaces where communication breakdowns occur, and online is certainly one of those. So we'll see how it works, but it's funny to hear what you're doing. I definitely feel like it's super aligned with like the frontiers that I'm trying to get into in the digital landscape. But
well, the approach that I'm doing is holding empathy circles. So we hold empathy circles. And people are holding them, all over the world. They just and then we have this training. So we form cohorts of about 20 people, and we have people who have done the training can be trainees and start learning how to train others. And then we have a 5-week session, 2.5-hour session where you actually start facilitating mini empathy circles, and you get support and feedback from the other participants. And so it's just sort of learning by doing, and it's scalable in the sense that the participants go and hold empathy circles with family and friends, come, report back how it went. They have support community, as well as they can start, they know how to facilitate, they get that support. And then they can also start training others too. So it's a bit of an empathy Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, that's great though. The circle never ends. I was in an empathy circle with Minter Dial. I don't know.
Yeah.
He was, and that was my first experience being in one. One that is called an empathy circle. Again, in our therapist training, like we have lots of very similar kind of experiences under different names, but it was for me pretty interesting to be with people that I had really no context for, which is super different again from the therapy setting where like there's an objective, you understand the person, but having this kind of purist, I am here to learn and listen, and I may know nothing about the person sitting across from me, and having that structure was really fascinating. Although we did get stuck in a loop of the person not feeling heard, and that I had also never witnessed before, like seeing what to do when like there's truly an impasse, like the reflection is not working and the being heard is not there, and like how do you kind of move into that mode, and those are things I need to think about too for my product and what we're doing, is like even with the correction, it doesn't mean that you can get it right. Like there may be a fundamental misunderstanding or that needs to be acknowledged as well.
Usually people feel heard eventually. There's also, if you're in a circle with several people, somebody may just not be hearing you because they're just not good at listening, and they're kind of adding their own, or something they're adding of their own, but then you listen to someone else and then they might hear you. And it's also, you just keep going until you feel heard. Even if you feel heard about not feeling heard, that's being a little bit heard.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't feel heard right now. I'm not understanding you.
You got it. I feel heard. I feel heard and not being heard. Yeah.
We have a game like that I used to do in trainings called Zingers, where I would have therapists give me the worst thing a patient has ever said to them, and we reflect it back. Like, you'll never understand me. You really want someone that understands you. Like you need someone that like gets where you're coming from, or like, I don't want to be here. Like, and yeah, you didn't, like all of these kind of things where you just practice repeating back, and then it's like, oh yeah, they get me. Not to be gimmicky about it, but again, those are like some of the approach that I've taken has been doing role plays and drills, like really similar to I don't know if you've heard of Tony Rumencier's work on deliberate practice. So he's a therapist that is working on having people role play situations that are difficult empathically, or that from a therapy perspective would lead to like countertransference, like something that's like really hard. So for example, those political conversations, and you role play it over and over and over again, like until you start to move past yourself some of the fears or anxieties about holding that space and being in that moment. And do that deliberately in practice before you encounter it with a patient, or before you go out into the real world, that you really like practice that listening, sit with the emotions that are evoked when you're across from someone that maybe is like very different to you, or is whatever, evoking something in you, and that you rehearse it and rehearse it and rehearse it. And some of my work aligns with that too, with this approach to empathy, where it's like, it's not enough to just tell people what to do. Like they really do have to go do the empathy circle. They have to really like do the batting practice with empathy. Like something has to be practiced before you can like start to have that next level experience of connection.
Yeah, that's why with the empathy circle, I see it as just keep doing the empathy circle, because it's rewiring your brain, right?
Yeah.
Neurons that fire together, wire together. So if your first response, instead of being, triggered, upset, angry about what someone says, is you've just done the listening so much, reflected so much, that your neural network pathway is really strengthened just to be listening. And so I think it's, you can't just do a workshop and that's sort of it. It's got to be, it's almost like a way of being, a way
it is a way of being. It's funny now because like my husband and friends, like I'm just so reflective sometimes that it actually in my own personal life has like a negative kind of connotation. They're like, wait, you're listening to me? No. So but it's like, you can't stop. Like I'm never not going to be that person. So once it's there, it's there.
Yeah, it's good when it's mutual too, when you have that mutual listening. If you can have that agreement, we're going to listen to each other in the relationship, right? Yeah.
Consent, I think, is really important, certainly, to make sure that people are ready to be received. And yeah, for therapists like me and empathic people like you, doing it all the time isn't necessarily effective if that's, people aren't ready for it. So.
Well, what are you working on now? Where's your immediate? You have quite a few different projects that you're working on. What's your sort of main direction for the future?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I've been kind of evolving this, and right now I am the CEO of Empathic, which basically is that kind of Grammarly for empathy, autocorrect. Or I even think of it almost like auto tune for text, where any communication can be made more empathic. And that isn't just in terms of word replacement, but it could be, as we've talked about, suggesting an in-person conversation, or doing something that's much more behavioral, rather than just tweaking the words, but like, here's how to have the connection in this moment. So that's my project that I'm focused on right now. We're in the process of raising seed for that, actually very close to getting that tied up, and that'll launch a multi-year journey for us trying to develop the software and work with partners to get this into spaces where there can be more reach and access. The empathy games that I created are also still going. They're played by crisis hotline members, the California Indian Health Service. Like we have a lot of reach to people that are using that in between empathy trainings, just to like hone the skills. So I haven't abandoned that project, and actually it's integral to the other work that I'm doing, because as folks are playing our games, they're helping me to understand and helping our models to understand like what empathy is in a very diverse sense. So we're not just having one type of person play our games, but like as many people across at least the US and globally that speak English, it's only English right now, playing the games and kind of ranking empathic statements when they play, providing them. So we're getting kind of a global sense of like, how do people perceive these skills, and ranking each other's responses to be the most empathic actually has like a great use for us because we can kind of see like, all right, this is got a global or a transcontinental sense of empathy. Like everyone likes this kind of response to this thing and they feel heard. So the games are ongoing. They're part of what helps us to make the corrections in our product. And I've moved, I'm still a researcher at University of Washington on a number of different projects, but I'm moving more into this, into industry, because I'm seeing that the impact and reach is just greater. I've started a collective called Therapists in Tech, which are people that are leaving academia and therapy spaces to go into industry. And really our mission is to bring in that clinical vision and the vision of humanity into the spaces that are having huge impacts on people's lives. So that's where I'm going, is kind of crossing over, trying to see if can we do this in this commercial sense. But yeah.
Okay, well, you're welcome to take part in an empathy circle sometime
I'd love
too.
to.
I've been, holding them, would like to do more around this racism topic. I just interviewed Daryl Davis. I don't know if you know him, but he's African-American who did listen to like the KKK members, and just through that listening, it was bringing people out of some of these extremist groups.
Yeah.
And so trying to do more in that area and kind of have a different, it's a whole other topic, but instead of being anti-racist, it's empathizing with racism and empathizing with anti-racism. So having a different point of view of being able to empathize with all points of view is building that culture of empathy. So I've been doing circles around that. So if you have any ideas for empathy circles, especially conflicts, different conflicts, love to hear those.
Oh yeah, there's no shortage of those. So yeah, I would love to partake in an empathy circle again. I honestly can't get enough of those kind of experiences. And it is one sad thing that's happened for me since moving into this like digital tech space, is that I was doing very similar to you, like lots of in-person trainings. It's just something very different about doing it with people. So I'd love to reconnect to that. It sounds like a great idea.
Okay, well, we've gone for about an hour. I can talk for hours on this topic, especially, I don't find someone as often that has that sort of kindred spirit of just seeing the importance of the empathic listening. A lot of people come at it from more of a sort of an intellectual, more of a exhortation. We have to be more empathic. I mean, it's good, but they don't have the vision of the nuts and bolts of just something that works really well. And
all nuts and bolts. And I get critiqued on that because they're like, wow, you're really working on these skills. And I was like, you need, like, it's great to have that other stuff and like vision, but like, if you do not have this capacity to do this skill, it's going to be tough. Like, we got to start with the basics. So I am totally aligned in that. That is where I have come to after all of this. So yeah, I'm glad to have, yes, met a kindred spirit aligned in that. And I think you actually find it too, not to keep waffling on, but my experience of working with folks that have been doing this for a long time, I do get a sense that after you've seen enough of this, that you start to really hone in on that experience. Like, we got to have this reflective listening first. So I don't think we're alone in that.
Okay, well, good. We'll keep in contact and follow up and see what the next steps there can be, maybe doing some empathy circles. So thanks. And there'll be down in the chat, there'll be all kinds of links to information about you too.
Thank you.
So thanks.
All right.
See you again. Bye for now.
Bye.